This is his first major show in the U.S. He's now based in Paris. He teaches at the Parsons program in Paris. And the show will debut here at Wesleyan and then travel to 3 other venues: the Ulrich Museum at the Wichita State, the Selby Gallery at the Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota, and the Fusner Museum at the Florida Institute of Technology. So we are delighted that the work of Evan Roth will make its way through these 2 parts of the country, and maybe more venues after people see this show. So I want to thank the Department of Art and Art History for their support, Information Technology Services for their support of the exhibition. And I just want to say a special thanks to Evan for being such a generous, communicative artist who really created this exhibition with us, with Zilka in mind. And a number of the works were scaled just so perfectly for our gallery, and I'm just so grateful to him for that kind of sensitivity and forethought. I also want to turn this over to Judy Fox, our curator, who's going to introduce Evan. So Judy, thank you.
Okay, it's 2009. Ginger Duggan, my co-curator, collaborator, and I are in Paris. Of course, we're going to see all that we possibly can. And at Fondation Cartier, we see the groundbreaking exhibition Born in the Streets that explored graffiti as a worldwide phenomenon through the work of 10 graffiti artists. And out of the cacophony and bright color, wild form that covered the museum inside and out, the work of one participant jumped out, kept grabbing us. Graphically striking, new kinds of images distinct from all those around, images drawing on the history of art in the context of the street, as well as placing the history of graffiti in the context of art, addressing language, gesture, embracing new technologies. Every work that grabbed us was by this artist, Evan Roth, someone clearly to watch. So we did. And we learned that he was born in 1978, one of the youngest graffiti artists in that Paris show. I'll show you the catalog here. My visual aid. Michigan, where both his parents are academics. He trained as an architect at the University of Maryland, and then for graduate school went on to Parsons, the New School for Design, to earn his MA in Communications, Design, and Technology. There he was class valedictorian. After a few years as a research and development fellow and then a senior fellow at IB from 2005 to 2007, the open source Creative Technology Lab for the public domain, Evan went on to form Free Art and Technology Research Lab, an internet-based art and technology collective dedicated to the intersection of open source hacking and popular culture. He had already co-founded the Graffiti Research Lab in 2005. Along the way, he moved to Asia, but the Paris show and the graffiti culture he found there were too strong a call to resist. He works and lives in Paris with his wife and tiny newborn daughter. I'd like to mention 3 notions at the core of Evan's prolific work as an artist that distinguish him from the coterie of artists working with open source imagery harvested from the internet. We can count in this category Sebring Versteeg, whose work you may remember seeing in Passing Time here at the Zilka a few years ago. Graham Parker, whose primary interest is the printed word. Eric Doringer, who looks to found objects. R. Luc Dubois, a map and chart maker, and so on. First, the universe of the internet, of programming and technology, are Evan's pencils, not the subject of his inquiry, but the means, his medium to make art. His work is not about these tools, but uses these tools to get at the essential questions that artists have been working on since the very beginning. Second, Evan explores and uses the hardware and software with which we are all intimately connected in order to get at that moment that defines both the hacker and the graffiti artist. And also the greats in all fields, from science to the arts. That moment when the private personal gesture has a huge cultural public effect. The scientist in her laboratory discovering a new gene that will change our life expectancy. Alice Munro penning a short story. Or the hacker who, with the press of a key, steals our entire identity. And third, finally, from this moment comes art. Not a chart, or a joke, or a crime. And this art looks like nothing you've ever seen before. You'll see when you look around the gallery. You may see references to Robert Morris and the importance of gesture, to the minimalists in seriality, to Joseph Beuys in adopting and adapting performance. But what drives Evan's restless mind has to be his gift as a keen cultural commentator and his soul, the soul of an artist. Roth's work is in a permanent collection in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It has been exhibited at Centre Pompidou, Kunsthalle Wien, Tate, London, among other museums. It's been on the front page of YouTube, and Evan has received numerous awards, I hope some rewards too, including the Golden Nika from Prix Arts Electronica, Rhizome, the New Museum Commissions, and the incredibly distinguished Smithsonian's Hewitt Design Award. A show at a gallery in Stockholm just opened, with Eindhoven, Dusseldorf, Munich, and Basel just ahead. Before turning the program over to Evan, please accept Ginger and my thanks for the opportunity and honor to work with Evan and with the Zilker Gallery once again, and to collaborate with all the terrific colleagues we have here. Evan.
Well, that was an embarrassingly nice introduction from both of you. Thank you so much. But yeah, I have one of these. There was a lot of work that went into the show that just opened up this afternoon by the team of us here. So if you sense excitement, it's because there's been many emails that have brought that work over from Paris. So we're all very excited. So I hope you're excited to check it out as well. I thought I would talk a bit about my practice in general today. I'm going to try to touch on most of the pieces that are in the exhibition. Some of the work is going to seem really different, so I'm hopefully going to, not different in terms of the individual pieces, but how they connect. So I'm going to try to put an emphasis on hopefully how these pieces string together, at least in our minds. A lot of the work that I'm making is at this overlap between what's happening in the arts and what's happening in hacker cultures. And so I've been sort of inspired by and exploring this kind of green zone in the middle here. More recently, I've been thinking, instead of this just about art and hacking, about this relationship between misuse and empowerment, how these two elements can come together to make work, whether that's happening in the gallery, which of course I do work in galleries as an artist. I have work that kind of spans in these different zones. So I have some work that shows up in these kind of traditional white wall rooms and takes the form of like prints and sculptures, and you'll see some of that in the exhibition. I have another body of work that happens in public space. This is from a series called Propulsion Paintings, which you'll see in the exhibition, that has to do with finding alternative uses for cans that spray. I also make work that is meant to be viewed natively within the internet browser. This is from a series called Tribute to Heather, which you'll see on this stack of routers with the gallery. So this series is really meant to be viewed in a browser. Like the way this is working is it's taking a single animated GIF file. It's basically copying and pasting it hundreds of times and renaming the files that when the browser loads, it thinks they're all different files. And so as it kind of slowly and clumsily tries to bring all these GIFs into one image, the animations sort of get out of sync and you're left with these kind of motion studies. And so they're very different venues for art, right? It's the gallery, the internet, and public space. And so what I see as connecting this is the notion of hacking, or the ideas that come from hacking open source culture, specifically the idea of misuse. So hopefully that will be clear in about 45 minutes from now. I thought I would start from back when I was a student. I went to I did an undergraduate in architecture at University of Maryland, and then I went to Parsons for a 2-year graduate in design and technology. And this was a big step for me, not only because it was the first time I was introduced formally to writing code and learned how to write code for people that actually knew how to write code, but it was also the first time I lived in New York, and I had moved from LA, so I kind of gave up the car, became a pedestrian, and was passing by all these voices that were happening in the street as I kind of would walk between Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan on my way to class. And so these two worlds of like code and graffiti were starting to get jumbled together in my head as I was thinking about a thesis project. And so the first thesis project I pitched, which got turned down, was one called Graffiti Taxonomy that exists in the gallery. And it kind of spawned from me reading a lot of Edward Tufte. And so I was thinking, like, how can I rip off Edward Tufte in a very ultimate way, right? Like, what would Edward Tufte do if he was walking around all this graffiti in New York? And so the answer I came to is one that he would get a data set, right? I was trying to think, it took me so long to consider myself an artist. I was like adamant that I was a researcher. And so I was thinking from that standpoint about research and trying to get a good data set. So the first thing I did was I just shot photographs of like every single graffiti tag that I would come by around the city. And I tried to do this without like an editorial eye, as Tim Gunn would say. I was trying not to curate. I was shooting based on rule sets. I would just like, if I saw a graffiti tag that was made with direct contact, ink on the wall, I would take a photograph of it. And so I had this huge database of graffiti that I was starting to develop. And then, so that was the first step. And then the next step Edward Tufte would have done is he has this idea of small multiples, right? Where if you have this large data set, you want that data represented in a similar visual language, right? With the idea being that if that data set is represented in a similar visual language, the differences between the data will be apparent, not in how they're rendered. And so I committed this kind of ultimate graffiti faux pas, which was like to remove it from its context, right? So I spent some time in Photoshop. I cleaned the tags from their surrounding. I removed the color data so it was just black. And then I would do kind of studies in letter forms and figure out which letters were the most used in various areas. And then I would do these kind of studies based on character. And so the way these prints, which you'll see in the gallery on the letter S, the way they work is you'll see the graffiti tags happening along the bottom. The A that's highlighted here is highlighted in red in the tag, so you can kind of see how it fit into the overall tag. But then you get these grids where you can see intent and you can see all these voices that are happening in the city with something as simple as like singular line, right? Something as simple as the letter O, how all these different people are representing them in very, very different ways. The prints that I have in the exhibition are a series of S's, which I like because it's this like singular line gesture and how that one line can be done in so many different ways by so many different people. And I view this project kind of like graffiti vision. So this is like what graffiti writers see when they walk around the streets, right? Like I, like many people, was kind of trained to ignore the advertisements, ignore the graffiti, just get from point A to point B. But when graffiti writers navigate the city, they see this whole other world. They're like looking up more often than the rest of us. And they see all these things that are happening around us. And so this piece and some of the other graffiti-related work that I was doing as a researcher, not as a graffiti writer, had to do with kind of trying to give people that gift, to be able to see like their surroundings in this new way. So this was Graffiti Taxonomy. You'll see these three prints as you enter. A related project, if you keep walking through past those prints in the gallery, is another series called Graffiti Analysis. So when Graffiti Taxonomy was turned down as a thesis proposal at Parsons, I was like, well, how about this one? So what this one was is dealing with graffiti as performance art rather than a visual art. So where Graffiti Taxonomy was looking at form, graffiti analysis was looking at dance, right? It was looking at gesture. It was saying if we forget all about the ink and the spray paint and the drips and just think about graffiti as this motion that these writers who have done this like thousands and thousands of times, and when you watch them write, like part of this came from I was meeting more graffiti writers and they were becoming friends of mine and I was documenting their work outside and watching them write. It was really powerful to watch how confident that gesture is. Like when you train to write so many times under harsh conditions, it's a really kind of beautiful dance. And so this was a software project where I was trying to figure out how can I, just like Tufte was visualizing these other data sets, like what would he have done with code? Like how would he have tackled looking at motion data surrounding graffiti? And so I started going to the NYU library and looking up every form of like visual writing descriptions I could find. So I was looking at both like Eastern and Western calligraphy styles and how those have been in print, kind of how are people depicting motion in print. and using that as like a jumping off point towards writing software. So the first version of that software looks like this on the right. So I would meet with graffiti writers, I would attach this light source to their marker, and then behind that screen is like a camera basically doing, at the time I thought super high-tech motion tracking, and now looking back on it, it's like motion tracking 101. It's like the simplest motion tracking you can do. But it was an interface that was kind of real. Like I was thinking, okay, if I'm gonna, again, like if I'm thinking like a data visualization expert like Mr. Tufte, it would be bad data to invite these graffiti writers into my studio and hand them a mouse, right? This would be bad data. They write very differently with a mouse than they would with their own tools. So this was a way they could bring in their own implements. I would attach this light source to it, and they could practice their craft without thinking about the technology. And I was digitizing it. So I was getting XY time data from that motion. And the way I was representing it was the particles you're seeing are based, well, they're being thrown off based on velocity. So you can see when a corner is being rounded very smooth, you'll get this even spread. When it's sort of jagged, you get these spikes that come off. The width of the white line is based on speed. So the thinner that line, the faster the pen was moving. And then the kind of the dimensionality comes from time being the third dimension. So it's kind of like you're writing on a piece of paper that's constantly pulling away so that you can rotate around and see how the ink is being lined up. And so that was kind of the current state of the software. And then I was thinking, part of the reason this was so fascinating to me is that I was getting to watch these people write. And this was something that you don't really get to see with graffiti unless you start either writing or going out with graffiti writers. And so the idea, the sort of culmination of this like 2-year thesis project was, okay, the data that I'm going to show is going to be then presented back in public space from whence it came, right? Kind of like from the premise that you get to see the ink on the mailbox the next morning or on your door, but you never get to see the act of it writing. So I was doing these projections around New York where similar sort of graphics as you see on the right here, but projected at these kind of big scales as a way of reintroducing that motion in the city. So that for a moment you can divorce yourself from the kind of vandalism conversation for a moment. You can just witness the movement, look at graffiti as a dance. And so I was doing these projections initially around New York, and started traveling with the project to other locations. And at some point I started to realize that like my data was inherently flawed because it wasn't good data, right? I was inviting graffiti writers into my studio, and they write much differently when they have nothing in their peripheral vision than when they're sitting at a comfortable desk, like having a beer. It's a very different experience, right? It's not actually writing graffiti. And so then I started working with a graffiti writer in Vienna, and he was pushing me on this. He was like, look, I don't write the same here as we do outside, so if you really want this project to be about good data, we've got to go outside. And so this video footage, which also shows up in the gallery, I'm going to show pieces of because it shows a bit how that capture process works. So here you can see some of the tracking and how that works. So I was basically going out with him and holding my laptop and being this kind of human tripod. It's not an ideal solution. The part of hacker culture is like finding the dirtiest, quickest way to your end goal. So in this case, I had the software running on my laptop, turned around towards the graffiti writer, and the webcam on the laptop was tracking that light source. And so it's coming away with these kind of visualizations of the data. Clearly, if you're a graffiti writer, it's not an ideal situation to have like a flashlight attached to your marker when you're running around illegally at night, but he was game to try. So here you can see it more clearly. Here he's doing it on glass. And so this is me trying to like record the data. This is him writing, and you can, if you look closely, you can see it starting to show up on the screen. And so then this was how I was starting to capture the data more. And this was, to be honest, it was a lot more fun, and it felt closer to representing what I wanted to, which was this kind of dance that happens when no one's looking. So one result from this was the software, which you'll see projected in the kind of dark gallery on the north side. There's also these sculptures. There's another piece of software that I created that will then load in that 3D motion track data and create these just algorithmically generate these sculptures based on the same principles. So again, like the thickness of the sculpture are based on speed. You can see like the thinner parts at the top are where he was moving quickly. The thicker parts are where the writer was slowing down. And so in the gallery, there's sculptures from 4 graffiti writers. One was from this graffiti writer you saw earlier who has no name, it's just his face. This is from a graffiti writer named Katsu from New York, who also writes a kind of skull-shaped tag. When the sun hits the gallery in the right way, there may be moments where in the shadow you can sort of see the two-dimensional form, but they're really meant to be these kind of like frozen moments in time, like where that 7 seconds of time it took to write that tag is now kind of visualized and frozen in a way that we can kind of walk around in. And so that piece was really about movement. It was like really more about movement than it was about graffiti in some sense. And they were also like hanging out with graffiti writers, it became clear that there was like, other parts of hacking culture that show up in graffiti practices as well. This was starting to affect the way I was thinking too. And so I was also starting to get interested that there was a lot of exhibitions happening. This is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, not far from the Born on the Streets exhibition. And a lot of times the exhibitions were focusing on the graffiti writers that either had connections to writers in the movie Style Wars or the ones that had the most biggest beautiful pieces. And this to me wasn't what graffiti was really about. And the graffiti writers that showed up in the city and were in the bathroom stalls in the gallery and were on the streets outside the museum, like those writers never really got represented in any of these overviews of graffiti that were starting to happen in museums and in cultural institutions. And so one thing that started to happen was I was highlighting those graffiti writers and collaborating with them on this practice, and then they started to get curated into these exhibitions. So it was a way to start to bring the part of graffiti that I thought was the most fascinating into these spaces in ways where sometimes the institutions were unclear about what they were actually bringing in. I mean, in this case in Vienna, that graffiti writer was just all over the place. And the fact that it was then presented on this pedestal and you have these people looking at it very carefully and cleanly, like I don't know how much they knew about that piece, but what I hope that they saw was that they would start recognizing these familiar faces around the city. So at the same time, this was kind of my thesis project expanded. This project that's like gone since school, or has continued since I left school, of course. But the other thing that happened during the time I was working on this was a 2-year project. I was learning how to write code for the first time. I'm not natively good at writing code. I'm not happy when I'm writing code. Generally, like miserable to be around when I'm attempting to write code. But I also tend to get bored really easily. So this 2-year project for me, as much fun as I was having, was also kind of like creatively very draining. And so at the same time I was doing that, I was trying to come up with these other like smaller pieces, like these like weekend projects. And I'm going to show one of those weekend projects not because it's the best work I've ever made, but because it's one I keep looking back to in my own practice when I find myself working too hard. So this was from 2004. This was when the Republican National Convention was in New York and artists were making these great art activist pieces and I wanted to take part. So this was my contribution. So I'll show this and then talk about its connection to hacking culture. This is called Postal Labels Against Bush. So if it's unclear, these are the postal labels you get for free at the post office when you send your priority mail. They kind of have a history with graffiti writers as being one of the first things you use when you start writing graffiti. And so I added just this one sentence that says, the U.S. Postal Service does not acknowledge the authority of the Bush administration. So it's a very small intervention, right? Like when I think about interesting hacks, I think about people that found interesting exploitations, right? You find a system that's bigger than yourself, you find a weakness in that system, and then you find a way to insert your ideals into a framework where those were never supposed to exist, right? So the weakness in this system is that the post office in downtown Brooklyn here, they weren't thinking that the postal label was an input, right? It was only an output. Like they were thinking you would take these, they weren't thinking you would be putting them back. And so by putting them back, you create this system where people are starting to mail these small messages around, and maybe nobody noticed, who knows. So I made this project. I had the idea like on a Friday. My wife's cousin was in town. We went out and did it on Saturday, uploaded it to the internet on Sunday. It was like a perfect project life cycle for me, like very, very lazy. And what I saw happening was that just from this like one little sentence, right, this piece started to spread around the web in like a pre-YouTube internet, right? There was an internet before YouTube. It was crazy. But there were blogs, and so blogs like Boing Boing picked up this project. This is the first time I saw something that I made really start to filter around the web in what we would now call like viral or contagious media, right? This was like a pre-social web, but there were still people there, things were happening. And that was like a big moment for me too, because I realized here was a project that I spent a weekend on, is perhaps more politically specific than my thesis project, and I think sometimes politically motivated projects are harder to spread than others. And it managed to take off, and people were picking on it like crazy. My server was crashing and getting all these comments, and I was getting feedback that I'd never gotten before from the internet, which was really exciting. And so for me, this was like a big kind of like, it was a big moment at the time for me. And it also kind of was changing the way I was starting to think about activism. Because I was also going to a lot of protests at the time, and carrying signs and marching and doing all the things that good activists do. But at the same time, I was watching movies the Yes Men were making. I was seeing early work by Banksy, and I was starting to think of activism could be something more fun. Like this could be something that people want to participate in, regardless of the politics. And so I started thinking about how this kind of viral media, which was kind of in its infancy, could be kind of combined in a way where you could spread ideals that maybe weren't necessarily innately popular in mass culture. So some of those ideas were swirling around in my head when I entered iBeam, which is this art nonprofit that you mentioned earlier. And at iBeam, I met some other more serious hacker types, like MIT types, like people that really knew how to write code, people that really had very serious relationships with the open source community. Like I was kind of passively involved in that movement earlier, but this was a really big introduction to that culture. My connections in the graffiti world were like building, like all my friends circle were like all becoming graffiti writers. And so with that, like this project called Graffiti Research Lab came out of me meeting a friend of mine named James Powderly, who is this kind of like former NASA robotics type who quit to come join this weird sort of hack lab. And we teamed up to make this Graffiti Research Lab project under the idea that what we saw happening in the hacker circles and graffiti writing communities were like really the same people that just hadn't met each other yet. And so we were going to try to make tools. Like we saw what we were doing as basically a tool making practice, and then we would make tools for people that live in cities but don't have voices as big as the advertisers have, right? So how can we make tools for people that would allow us, for example, to have pixels, right? You go to Times Square and advertisers get to speak in light. So we were thinking like, okay, what's the dirtiest, stupidest, cheapest way that we can give light and pixels over to people that maybe only have $50 to tell their story instead of $50,000 to tell their story. So this is one of the first technologies we made. Just when you think of it as a technology, it's just an LED, a very strong magnet, and a little battery all taped together. But when bought in mass, they got very cheap. And so then we would go out and in mass and throw them at shit, basically, in the beginning. The initial tests were like, kind of just like, does this work as a visual communication system in the city? And so after doing that once or twice, we were like, okay, this is like environmentally not responsible at all. And all we did was make this train look like a Christmas tree. So then we tried to figure out how can we inject content into this, right? And so then we put how-to guides online. Like we felt like our job wasn't to make content, our job was to kind of empower street artists, graffiti writers, activists. And so we put these instruction sets online. We would work with groups, kind of irregardless of their politics, if they were interested in using our tools to make things. And so like one kind of turning point for us with this technology was the Students for Free Tibet during the Beijing Olympics made this Free Tibet banner. And instead of using paint for their banner drop, they used our LED drogue technology. And what happened was this image, which is very mediagenic, right? Much more mediagenic than a banner with black paint, ended up getting on the front page of the New York Times and spreading around the blogosphere like crazy because the media could care less about writing about the Free Tibet project, right? They've been doing it for years and people are tired of hearing about this. But they love thinking that we're living in the future, right? If you provide the media with the myth that we're living in the future, they will write about anything. And so the myth that we gave the media was, look, we're living in the future. Graffiti writers have technology. This is crazy, right? And so they would write about not just this project, but many of the projects that we were doing or that we facilitated were getting more media attention than they probably deserved, just because there was like LEDs involved and there were lasers involved. And so this is when James and I started realizing that like the hacking that was much more interesting was social hacking rather than technical hacking. Like wrapping the LED and tape with magnets and battery was like kind of interesting. But the fact that this allowed these kind of semi-unpopular ideals to get such mainstream media coverage, the social hack is like where the juice was. And so this is kind of where we started focusing more of our effort. We made other technologies. This is one called laser tag. This was a motion tracking system similar to graffiti analysis in a sense, only it was made for more public display. So we would set up a camera and a projector facing the building, and then we would invite graffiti writers and activists and just hand them this laser and point at the building, and the interface was very intuitive. Like once you saw someone write their name with the laser, you got it, and then you could just pass the laser around, and it became this kind of free speech amplification project where we would allow people to write at the scale of the city, kind of whatever they wanted in a sort of uncurated way. So these were the kind of projects that James and I were doing with a larger group of collaborators. This was Theo Watson, who's a great artist, was also involved in making the software for this. So we were making these projects. Our sphere of collaborators was growing, and at one point we realized like we've kind of almost like outgrown graffiti in a sense, where what we were more interested in is like how can we get these ideals that are related to free culture to spread into popular culture. Graffiti was a good mechanism, but it doesn't have to be graffiti, right? Graffiti is just one popular cultural mechanism to get through that kind of door into mass culture. And so we ended up kind of changing our approach into this other group called the Free Art Technology Lab, which is very much still active. This is a group pictured here. We live on the internet. We kind of collaborate through cheap, open source, free, old technologies like email lists. This is our main technology we use. We, as an organization, don't seek out any money. We don't have any formal rule structure within the group. There's no hierarchy within the group. Everyone has all the passwords to everything. Sometimes people get the password and change it, so some people have it, and the idea is the passwords are just kind of floating in the ether. So it was kind of an experiment with like respectful anarchy amongst friends. And so we were making these projects that were kind of pop media projects that were surrounded free culture ideals, surrounding around free speech ideals. And even though we didn't have like a mission statement, we kind of landed on this Tootsie Pop theory, which is that at the substance of what we were doing, there was something there. There was that like sweet chocolate center, right? That we'd try to wrap those in candy so it would like go down easier. There's these artists, even Franco Mattes, I really like, they describe this as radical entertainment, right? That we can be making media that can spread and be fun to just watch, but then it also has these messages tied in. So I'll show one of our more popular projects. We like to, we have a very complicated relationship with Google, let's say. So I'll show one piece that we did collectively called Google Street View. And again, this is going to be an example again of a social hack. Like, what we did was we rented a car, we bought a roof rack on eBay for 15 euros. Everything above the roof rack is all cardboard and colored tape, right? There's no technology involved. It was just a social hack where we look very convincingly like the Google Street View car, right? And so then the idea was we would drive around and try to put Google in a situation which it wouldn't want itself publicly showing up on the internet. We would get lost and ask for directions. It's good to like get Google and Chinese talking more, but they have a lot to talk about. We had also leaked on the internet where we bugged with the GPS device a real Google Street View car, and we're plotting its points on a Google map. so people could show up and try to find it, even though obviously we didn't really vote. This was like a real good Samaritan who we were trying to stage a carjacking, and he really saved the day. I'm really interested in these kind of self-empowerment situations, and like driving the Google Street View car was one of the most empowering things I've ever done in my life. You exist outside the rules. So this is an example of some of the work that the Fat Lab might do, right? It's meant to be entertaining. We'd love to hear people laughing at it, and then we try to like get some perhaps questions started surrounding like, I don't know, the consumption of every single data that we touch on the internet, right? Like we're all touching Google servers constantly, perhaps like 80 or 90% of the time around the internet. So we all have these very like complicated issues with Google. Like we all, like many people in the group still have Gmail accounts. Like we also think it's important that we don't have like Google vegans. Like we're all super confused as well, you know? Another piece that I did with the Fat Lab is this piece that's in the exhibition called Ideas Worth Spreading. So this is an installation that's kind of a vehicle to the internet. And so it looks just like a TED stage. And it's an interactive piece where you can step into the red circle, and you can put on the kind of flesh tone microphone, and you can pose for photos, doing whatever you want. You can also give talks. And then as you put these photos on the internet, Google gets really confused, right? So if you do a Google image search for TED Talk, you can see like this is one from my installation. So you're starting, the idea is like here's, you know, you're just 2 images away from Bill over here, you know? And so again, like thinking about the hack, thinking about misuse, like there's a sort of exploitation here, which is that TED's brand is really easy to rip off, you know? It's like Helvetica Bold in true red, you know? It couldn't be easier to duplicate. And so it becomes, you know, it's kind of trying to raise this question of like curation and free speech, and like, is this conference that's all about ideas worth spreading? Are there really all that many ideas being spread, or is it just from this one segment of the population? And so this piece is in the gallery, so I invite you to take your photo. If you're kind of a more super user, you can bring your laptop with your own presentation to the exhibition. You can plug in, you can film your own TED Talk using that backdrop, and if you set the camera up just right, you don't see any of the edges, so it sort of feels like you're existing within the TED world. There's a USB stick connected to the projector that you'll see in the gallery, and that has the TED intro sequence, the TED outro sequence. It has like standing ovations. You can give yourself a standing ovation, which is how every TED Talk ends. There's also just crowd shots. You can cut to like these amazing halls of like people just pondering. So it's meant in some way like this TED sign is kind of like, I think of it like this sculpture that just sort of emits power, right? So you can come in the gallery and stand in front of its presence and like soak up some of its power and see what it feels like to have those letters behind every word you say, right? Because the internet will listen to you if you stand in front of these 3 letters, so please use it. So the work that Fat does, the work that I do, I think has this idea of thinking about an audience that's maybe more than just an art audience and more than just a gallery audience. The person who kind of started this lab at Ivy, who went on to found BuzzFeed, he's like owns the internet now. His name is Jonah Peretti, and he was in that lab with us and thinking a lot about contagious media. He coined the term contagious media. And he also coined this term the bored at work network, which I really love. And so I think about this bored at work network being like a primary audience, right? That a lot of the media that I'm making can hit people in this place in their lives where they're really open to new ideas, right? And you're sitting in your office cubicle. Maybe you haven't all experienced this yet, but it's terrible. It's terrible. My whole art practice is like the reaction of being in one of these for 2 years and trying to escape. But it's still a great place to hit people with art, like perhaps as interesting a place as an art gallery. And so I'm thinking about that audience as much as I'm thinking about these alternative, these more traditional art audiences. And I've seen this in a few occasions start to happen where there's this one life that happens in the gallery and this other life that happens on the internet. This happened with GRL a lot, where we were getting really nice attention from places like the MoMA, and they were showing our work, and at the same time we have YouTube views with enough views that at the time this was a lot. Like 1 million is like nothing now, but like at the time we were like, oh my God, we broke 1 million views, that's incredible. And so this is the place I'm like really interested in. The art that I'm inspired by and the art that I'm making is this like very tiny sliver where like the art world intersects with the real world, right? It does exist, I've seen it. There's not much of it, but it's there. And I think the way that happens is through the web. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing is kind of, if not on the web, inspired from culture that comes through the web. How are we looking at time? What time am I supposed to end?
We have another, I'd say like 8 minutes.
Oh my God, I didn't even get into like the stuff in the show yet. Okay, what do you want to talk about? I've got like 200 more slides. I talked a little bit. I'll show. Okay, babe. So this is kind of like where the art and hacking thing comes into me, right? But that kind of like that little red sliver. And the hacker culture that I'm more specifically interested in, there's kind of like 2 waves of hacking culture. And the first that really inspired me is the hacking culture that grew up with Linux, which is an operating system much like OS X and Windows. Even if you haven't used it on your personal computer, you've used it when you touch the internet. Like the internet is powered by Linux servers. And Linux, unlike OS X and Apple and Microsoft and Windows, was made from a very different model, right? Like it wasn't made in a kind of capitalistic model where the innovation is driven through hopes of money at the end, right? It was made by people who were giving away everything for free, volunteering time, this community that kind of became the free software movement or the open source movement, where the motivation was it was a gift-giving culture. Like you rise or fall as a community member based on the quality of the gifts you give away to that culture. So it's a very, very different model. And to me, this is a super inspiring piece of technology in the sense that it's a very complicated piece of technology. Operating systems are like one of the most complicated pieces of technologies that are out there in terms of software, right? And the fact that this could be made by a group of people that were having fun is a motivating factor. To me, is astonishing. I don't think the whole world should run that way, but it makes me really happy that pockets of the world run this way. So this is the hacking culture where I started really getting influenced by, the one that grew up with Linux and the open source movement. I've read a lot of like hacker texts, and this phrase, playful cleverness, comes up a lot, which I like a lot, like this idea that fun can be a part of all these things. I think that there's more space for fun in the arts for sure. I think there's more space for fun in activism, and hackers kind of have this idea down. A few more minutes, let's do. So this is a series that has a connection point to fun. This is a series called Multi-Touch Paintings. And it has to do with these new gestures that we're all making on touchscreens, right? These like things that feel very high tech, but we're all kind of clumsily looking at and like swiping and sliding to unlock like over and over and over again, right? That our technology and these interface devices that are in all of our pockets are like training us to do these gestures that like humans haven't ever had to do in evolution, and now we're like doing this over and over and over again. And so I'll put tracing paper over my phone and then ink my fingers and perform these kind of very simple gestures, very intimate gestures. This is me typing in my username and password. This is what zooming in and out looks like. I'm really fascinated by this idea of casual computing, how computing is changing in a way, and now that it's in our pockets all the time, our interactions are very different with it, and we get addicted to things like Angry Birds. So this is, I started recording me playing Angry Birds all the time, because I harbor all this like guilt about the fact that there's all these things going on in the world, and I'm sitting here like killing pigs with birds, you know? So I don't have photos of it here, but there's an installation in the gallery that's called Level Cleared, which is, in this example, the level 1 is in the upper left corner, and I just sat and I played Angry Birds until I beat the whole game, which is down here 1,500 sheets later. And so you'll see in the gallery, it's meant to be this like, for me, it's meant to be this kind of like crippling, depressive relationship that I definitely have with my iPhone. Thankfully I moved on from Angry Birds, but now I'm even more addicted to Candy Crush. So it just got like worse. So it's meant to be this visualization on the one hand of these new gestures and have this kind of like humorous connection to pop culture, and then on the other hand, it's meant to be this like kind of like really depressing piece about how we're spending our time in these like giving away these like small moments every day to our computers. There's also a nice moment in the gallery where there's a slide to unlock wallpaper on the wall here, and if you take this kind of photo in the portrait mode with your iPhone and you set it to the wallpaper of your phone, you get like the slide to unlock, the functional slide to unlock. So this is a nice like takeaway from the show that you'll only get if you're here kind of away from keyboard. We're close to the end here, right? Okay, I'm just gonna jump forward. There's a lot more stuff in the show. We can talk about it when we go over there. I'll show this piece last just because I think it's even though it's not in the show, I think it's a good kind of explanation about this idea of hacking and empowerment. This is a piece I did a little bit over a year ago now in Vienna where I rented a van, I got a local phone number, I put the phone number of my cell on the van, a loudspeaker on the roof, and have this arrow pointing to the loudspeaker, just this one word invitation, free, right? So that's all the information the viewer would get. I drove around Vienna for the course of 3 days. I'll show quickly what that looked like. So that to me is like, that's the reaction I want from art, you know, like that kind of reaction. And so that's, even though this piece is in the show, to me, like the ideas that are kind of summed up in that piece show up in all the pieces, or I hope to. And the idea is, again, that like this very simple technology, there's no code involved, there's no software, it's just a cell phone plugged into a loudspeaker, right? Very low technology, very cheap to reproduce, but sets up this kind of empowerment situation where like you hear people calling in and they're just like laughing because they have this new power, right? This kind of unexpected power has been thrust upon them as they're just like going about their day, getting coffee and going to work. And that kind of empowerment experience, I think, is what is like, is why I think hacking is so interesting, right? Like the hacking isn't like an end, it's like a means, right? It's like the idea of hacking to me is so interesting because these little changes in these systems that we maybe didn't have as much power over, we didn't have this loud of a voice in the city with this like very tiny, simple, very lazy change, whether it's like through the loudspeaker or the internet or graffiti writing or brand misrepresentation. These little shifts can like give us this louder voice in culture. So I hope that's evident in many of the pieces you see in the exhibition. I think I'll leave it there since there's more to be seen than what's on Pixels. You can go see them in AFK. I'd like to invite you to use the TED stage. You know, it's very easy to get the photo. So take the photos, upload them to the internet. It'd be awesome if people really wanted to give talks. Like the crazier, more outrageous talks, the better. It's there for you to use for the month, so please spread the word that it's there. There's also stickers at the entryways. If you want to donate your intellectual property upon your unfortunate death, with this sticker on the back of your driver's license, you can do so. Don't know how legally binding it is, you can try. So those are both invitations you can take part in the exhibition. I really wanted to thank like Ginger and Judy especially for this, making all this happen, and Pam played a huge role in this as well. We had this great team. Lee did a ton of work. I don't know if Lee's here, but Lee like knocked out the whole exhibition practically. John did a lot. JD, I don't know if he's here, he nailed in almost all the nails that you're going to see in the Level Clear piece, which is a lot of nails. Virgil, if he's here, helped out a ton. He has an exhibition just to the right of the entryway, so check out his work as well. If you want to find me on the internet, you can Google search badass motherfucker and hit I'm feeling lucky. It will take you to my page. My email is also at the bottom, so if that's easier. So thank you so much. It was really a long time with our team to get here today. So thank you.
Wesleyan is moderating a panel that will continue this conversation around art and open source. It'll feature Joyce Jacobson, Dean of the Social Sciences, Greg Goldberg from Sociology, Max Dietz, a sophomore here at Wesleyan, Alec McClain from the library, and Isabella Lipke, who's a Wesleyan alum who's pursuing a PhD at Princeton in this subject matter. So please join us next Tuesday at 4:30 and come down and have some time to chat with them. Thank you.
If you have questions, I'm happy to